Burn it all. The vehicles, the guns, the comms, burn it to the ground.
But sir, the nearest base is 200 kilometers across open desert. We've got ammo here, secret codes, wheels. If we burn them, we're walking. We won't survive.
Perform the task. Either we burn it all ourselves right now, or by tomorrow morning, Saddam will know our call signs and our routes.
The Iraqi desert, January 1991. Dead of night and 15 degrees below zero. All around, hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory and Saddam's army patrols. 16 men from the British SAS faced a choice. Risk everything to save their gear, or destroy it and disappear into the void. They chose the fire. 4 massive Land Rovers, a fortune in steel, turned into blinding torches. At that time, Saddam Hussein was launching Scud missiles at Israeli cities, and the British had to stop them at any cost. But how did 16 men without vehicles outsmart an entire army and walk 200 kilometers across open sand with 45-kilogram rucksacks? Right now, you're going to find out. This is the story of Patrol Delta 40.
In January 1991, American command had a massive problem that neither smart bombs nor billion-dollar satellites could solve. That problem was the Scud. Saddam Hussein knew he'd get crushed in a fair fight, so he played his ace. He started launching missiles at Israel. The logic was diavolishly simple. If Israel retaliated, the Arab nations would pull out of the US coalition, and the entire Western campaign against Iraq would collapse like a house of cards. The war could have turned into a global firestorm. In the headquarters, American General Norman Schwarzkopf was literally fuming. His prized Air Force couldn't find those damn launchers. The Scud missiles were hidden on massive Soviet 8-wheeled trucks. These machines were ghosts. They'd roll out of hiding into the open desert, raise the missile, fire, and disappear within 90 minutes. CIA satellites would fly over the spot, only to find nothing but tread marks in the sand. The vast Anbar province, the size of Switzerland, became a Scud sanctuary. American F-15 pilots were bombing everything they saw: empty fuel trucks, plywood decoys, old shacks. But the real missiles kept flying. That's when British General Peter de la Billière, who had once commanded Special Forces himself, went to the Americans and said, "Your tech isn't cutting it. Let my boys in. We'll find them by hand." Schwarzkopf didn't like Special Forces. He called them cowboys, but he had no choice. So, the British SAS regiment got the order to go deep into the Iraqi rear. For this task, they formed several mobile groups. One was a patrol codenamed Delta 40. 16 men on 4 specially prepared Land Rover 110s. These vehicles deserve a mention of their own because at that time, they looked like the pinnacle of military engineering to the boys. These weren't your standard off-roaders. They were fighting platforms. Everything extra was stripped off. No doors, no roofs, no windshields. Why? To eliminate sun glint and to allow the men to fire in any direction instantly. Instead, they bolted on so much iron that the suspension was screaming. Every vehicle carried a heavy American .50 caliber Browning machine gun, a beast that can punch through a brick wall and shred a truck from 1.5 miles away. They also packed Milan anti-tank missiles and a mountain of ammo, 2,000 rounds per gun. The trucks were packed to the brim, spare fuel cans, 200 liters each, massive water tanks, food for 2 weeks, sleeping bags for freezing desert nights, and secret radios. Each Rover cost about 60,000 pounds, huge money back then. With all the gear, the patrol was carrying £250,000 worth of equipment. And every man knew, if they got caught, it wouldn't just be a failure. It would be a royal gift for Iraqi intelligence. On January 22, 1991, As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Delta 40 crossed the Saudi border and slipped into Iraq. Behind the wheels were experienced men, average age 32. Many were veterans of the Falklands and Northern Ireland. They weren't Hollywood bodybuilders, they were professional blue-collar operators. They moved only at night, navigating by the stars and primitive GPS units that were constantly glitching. The desert there isn't the pretty dunes you see in movies. It's a flat gravel plain as hard as concrete, littered with sharp rocks. During the day, they threw camo nets over the trucks and literally pressed themselves into the dirt in dry riverbeds, wadis, hoping Iraqi helicopters wouldn't spot them. For the first few nights, everything was perfect. They made it 190 kilometers behind enemy lines, found the first Scud positions, and beamed the coordinates to HQ. An hour later, coalition jets turned those trucks into piles of burning scrap. The system worked. The SAS was happy. The Americans at HQ were stunned. But the desert knows how to wait. It doesn't like those who rely too much on motors and electronics. And on the fifth night, Delta 40 realized their luck had run out. The iron started giving up first. By their fifth night, deep inside the Iraqi rear, the men of Delta 40 learned a hard truth. The desert isn't just a location on a map. It is an abrasive mechanism, a relentless grinder designed to wear down everything living and mechanical. They were 190 kilometers from the border, surrounded by nothing but jagged rocks, choking dust, and a cutting northern wind that sucked the heat out of their bodies, even through the most expensive tactical jackets. On the night of January 26th, the lead Land Rovers front differential simply disintegrated. In a normal environment, that's a repair job. In the Iraqi desert, where you are constantly jumping over boulders and crossing deep, steep-sided dry riverbeds called wadis, it was a catastrophe. Without four-wheel drive, a 3-ton vehicle becomes a dead weight. Attempting a field repair while Iraqi helicopters could appear on the horizon at any second was pure suicide. The sergeant major, the patrol commander, didn't hesitate. The SAS has a fundamental rule. If your equipment stops being a tool and starts being a liability, you get rid of it. But you do it in a way that ensures the enemy doesn't find so much as a rusty bolt for their intelligence officers to study. The demolition specialist placed 2 thermite grenades on the engine block and 1 inside the communications suite. Thermite isn't like normal explosives that make a lot of noise. It's a mixture of aluminum powder and iron oxide that burns at an incredible 2,200 degrees Celsius. It's hot enough to melt steel and aluminum into a puddle of liquid slag. Within 30 seconds, the first rover was an incandescent white bonfire. The operators didn't even look back. They were already busy cramming ammunition, water, and extra gear into the remaining 3 trucks. Now, the situation turned from bad to grim. 16 grown men, along with all their heavy equipment, were squeezed into 3 vehicles. Each remaining Land Rover was overloaded by at least 200 kilograms beyond its maximum desert patrol weight. The suspension was bottomed out, the tires were digging deep into the loose gravel, and fuel consumption doubled instantly. The sergeant major would later write in his operational log that the trucks handled like shopping trolleys filled with bricks. They had lost their speed, and their maneuverability had vanished. The real blow came 2 nights later, on January 28th. The second vehicle slammed into a sharp, hidden rock. The impact punched a hole straight through the oil sump. Thick, black oil began to bleed out onto the white sand. For an internal combustion engine, this is the equivalent of a slit throat. Without oil, the motor would seize up within hours. The group stopped, trying desperately to plug the leak, but their oil reserves were low and the desert was demanding its payment. At the same time, a priority warning came in from the SAS tactical headquarters. CIA signals intelligence had intercepted Iraqi radio chatter. The enemy had sniffed them out. The Iraqis were talking about suspicious foreign vehicles operating south of the main road. Saddam had ordered his patrols to intensify. Now, the desert was crawling not just with trucks full of soldiers, but with mobile hunter groups on light jeeps armed with heavy machine guns. And they were specifically looking for tracks. Patrol Delta 40 was caught in a pincer. On one side, they had 3 overloaded vehicles, one of which was bleeding to death. On the other, hundreds of Iraqi soldiers were closing the circle, tracking the deep tread marks and the noise of their engines in the silent night. They were 35 kilometers from their target, the main Baghdad highway, and over 170 kilometers from the emergency extraction point where a helicopter was supposed to snatch them. The sergeant major gathered his senior NCOs for a briefing in a dusty ditch. He laid out the map and pointed at the cold, hard numbers. The mathematics of survival were brutal. If they kept driving, the vehicles would fail in the middle of a firefight. If the Iraqis caught them, they wouldn't be able to outrun them in these armored cows. But the most terrifying risk was the equipment. If they lost control of the vehicles, the Iraqis would capture the encrypted codebooks, the radio frequency lists for the entire coalition, and the Milan missile systems. It would be a failure of the entire regional intelligence network. The decision was made in 30 minutes. In any other military unit, it would have been called insane. But for these men, it was the only professional path left. They decided they would no longer be dependent on iron and wheels. They decided that their own legs were more reliable than 60,000-pound engines. They decided to burn everything that was left and walk. No heavy machine guns, no massive water tanks, no sleeping bags. Just 16 men, their rifles, and 200 kilometers of hostile, empty darkness. The night of January 29th became the brightest and most expensive in the history of Patrol Delta 40. At 01:15 hours, the sergeant major gave the order that any other military unit would have considered a mental breakdown. The 3 remaining Land Rovers, packed to the roof with high-tech gear, were lined up in a shallow desert depression. The men placed thermite charges directly onto the engine blocks, the radio sets, and the heavy machine gun mounts. This wasn't an emotional outburst from a cornered unit. It was a cold, surgical calculation. The sergeant major knew that if they tried to break through the Iraqi lines in those overloaded pinkies, they would be sitting ducks. In the silence of a desert night, the roar of a diesel engine carries for miles. If a vehicle seized up in the middle of a contact, it meant certain death or capture. But the hardware wasn't the main concern. The information was. Each Land Rover carried a secret Klansman radio suite with built-in encryption modules. Inside the glove boxes were the frequency tables for the entire coalition and the codes for calling in air support. If the Iraqis captured even one of those units intact, the entire military machine from Kuwait to Jordan would have to stop and reset their communications. It would have paralyzed the CIA and the American generals for at least 72 hours. The cost of such a failure would be measured in billions of dollars and hundreds of lives. Against that nightmare, 4 trucks worth 240,000 pounds were a drop in the bucket. When the thermite ignited, the desert was flooded with a deathly white light for several minutes. The 2,200-degree heat melted aluminum like candle wax. Steel frames buckled and warped, and the barrels of the heavy Browning machine guns twisted into useless scrap. The men stood a few hundred yards away, silent, watching 250,000 pounds of elite equipment burn into the sand. But the hardest part was just beginning. Destroying the trucks was easy. Deciding what 16 men could carry on their own shoulders was the real nightmare. This is where the physical survival of the patrol began to look like a horror story. They stripped away every single thing that provided comfort. The sleeping bags were the first to go into the fire. In the desert, it drops to -12 at night, but a sleeping bag weighs 3 kilograms. In the world of the SAS, 3 kilos equals 100 extra rounds of ammunition or 2 liters of water. They chose the ammo. Tents, spare clothing, heavy food rations, it was all discarded. Each man loaded up an enormous Bergen rucksack weighing 45 kilograms. To put that in perspective, imagine carrying a full-grown teenager on your back while walking over jagged rocks and ankle-snapping gravel for 8 hours straight. The packs contained only the essentials, at least 300 rounds of rifle ammo per man, grenades for the underbarrel launchers, 1 single portable radio for the whole group, and water. Water was the primary killer. The trucks had held 200 liters. Now, the men were limited to just 8 liters each. That had to last them through 36 hours of high-intensity marching. If they didn't find a source or get picked up by then, the patrol would simply dry up and blow away under the sun. At 01:15, the desert returned to pitch darkness. The bonfire died down, leaving behind nothing but mounds of black, smoking slag. The sergeant major adjusted the straps of his Bergen, checked his rifle, and gave a silent wave toward the south. The men of the SAS formed 2 columns of 8. They kept a distance of 200 meters between the groups, ensuring that one lucky burst of fire couldn't wipe them all out at once. They didn't run. They moved with a rhythmic, heavy, mechanical step, the gait of men who knew they had 200 kilometers of hell ahead of them, where every extra breath could be their last. Back at the headquarters in Riyadh, the American Special Ops officers stared at their monitors. The tracking beacons for Delta 40 had vanished. The signals had been incinerated along with the trucks. To the generals, this meant only one thing. The patrol was either dead or in an Iraqi prison. No one in their right mind could have imagined that 16 men had just decided to challenge the entire Iraqi army on foot. But in the darkness, 16 shadows had already dissolved into the night. They had no wheels, no heavy guns, and no room for error. They only had their legs, their will, and 200 kilometers of enemy territory crawling with hunters. The walk, which would later be remembered as the longest and most grueling trek in the history of modern warfare, had officially begun. The first night of the foot march stripped away any illusions. 45 kilograms on your back isn't just a number. It's like having a full-grown man clinging to your shoulders while you're ordered to hike over jagged stone for 8 hours without stopping. In the SAS regiment, they call these marches tabbing. It's a brutal test of resilience where your body screams in pain, but your brain forces your legs to keep driving forward. In that first night alone, the group covered 38 kilometers. That's an unbelievable result, even for an elite athlete traveling light. For men with massive rucksacks in total darkness, it was beyond the limit of human endurance. But they had no choice. At sunrise, the desert becomes an open arena where a human silhouette is visible for miles. During the day, they found sanctuary in a shallow wadi, a dry ditch barely a meter deep. 16 men literally pressed themselves into the earth, hidden under camouflage netting. There were no sleeping bags. They'd been burned with the trucks to save weight. The daytime temperature barely rose above freezing, and the biting wind cut straight to the bone. No one slept. They sat huddled together to preserve whatever body heat they had left, taking turns on 2-hour watch shifts, scanning the horizon. If an Iraqi patrol had driven 10 meters away, they wouldn't have seen them. But if one man had sneezed or clinked a canteen, the group would have been finished. On the second night, the water crisis hit. 8 liters per man sounds like plenty if you're sitting in an office, but when you're hauling 45 kilos of gear and sweating through your layers, it is catastrophically low. The sergeant major enforced a brutal limit:
1 liter per 24 hours. That's 4 times less than the recommended intake for that level of exertion. Lips began to crack and bleed, tongues stuck to the roofs of mouths, and heads throbbed with the dull ache of dehydration.
At one point, they spotted a Bedouin well ahead. To a man dying of thirst, it was a mirage made real. But the sergeant ordered them to bypass it. It was the hardest decision of the march. The commander knew that a single stray shepherd spotting them at the water would report their presence to the Iraqi military within the hour. Then, 16 exhausted men with rifles would be facing armored vehicles and heavy machine guns. The sergeant's words were short. Better to be alive and thirsty than dead at a well. They kept moving, leaving the water behind. By the 4th night, the march had become the mechanical movement of zombies. Men were stumbling on flat ground. Dehydration was attacking their minds, focus blurred, and some began to see hallucinations in the moonlight. But SAS discipline is something beaten into your soul during selection. Even in a semi-conscious state, they held their formation and checked their bearings by compass every 400 meters. They knew if one man lagged or fell, it put the entire patrol at risk. They moved right past the very highway they were hunting. Through their binoculars, they watched convoys of Iraqi trucks carrying fuel and Scud missiles heading west. These massive 8-wheeled behemoths rumbled past just a few kilometers away. The special ops team recorded the times, the number of vehicles, and their heading. This data was priceless. Every few hours they sent short, encrypted burst signals back to HQ. Meanwhile, back at the American headquarters in Saudi Arabia, CIA analysts had already closed the file on Delta 40. On the maps, they were marked as MIA, likely captured. Not a single expert from the Pentagon believed a group could survive in this sector of the desert without vehicles. The planners had officially categorized these lands as impassable for infantry. But on the 5th night, with only a few kilometers left to the extraction point, lights appeared on the horizon. They had reached the zone. The men were out of water, their feet were a mass of bloody blisters, and every step sent a jolt of pain through their spines. But they made it, all 16 men. No losses, no complaints, and no wasted words. They had done what the computers said was impossible. Now, only one thing remained. Meet their own people and explain why they'd left 250,000 pounds of iron melting in the sand. At 02:45 on the morning of February 2nd, the heavy rhythmic thumping of rotor blades echoed across the edge of the Anbar Desert. A massive Royal Air Force Chinook from 7 Squadron touched its wheels to the sand, kicking up a blinding storm of grit. The loadmaster later recalled that he expected to see a crowd of broken, half-dead men begging for salvation. Instead, 16 shadows emerged from the blackness. They moved with precision in a perfect tactical formation, covering each other's sectors. They methodically loaded their heavy rucksacks, checked the ground one last time to ensure nothing was left behind, and stepped into the cargo bay in total silence. There were no cheers, no hugs, no emotional outbursts. The only thing one of the operators asked was, "Does anyone have some water?" 4 minutes later, the helicopter was airborne, banking south toward the Saudi border. For Patrol Delta 40, the job was done. But for the staff officers in Riyadh, the friction was just beginning. When the group returned to base, the standard after-action debriefing began. On one hand, the results were phenomenal. The patrol hadn't just survived, they had brought back logs filled with priceless intelligence. Those specific traffic patterns and supply route timings allowed coalition aircraft to hunt down and destroy 14 Scud support vehicles in the following week alone. They had successfully mapped the logistics arteries of the southern desert. By every operational metric, The mission was a 100% success, achieved without a single casualty. But there was one detail that sent American command into a state of cold fury. When the equipment loss report landed on the desk of a U.S. Army logistics colonel at Special Ops headquarters, he nearly lost his mind. The document stated plainly, destroyed 4 vehicles, 8 heavy machine guns, 4 anti-tank missile systems, and classified encryption hardware. The total value? Nearly $370,000 at the time. The American colonel called it the most expensive bonfire in Special Ops history. In the U.S. military logic of the time, equipment was an asset to be protected, repaired, and returned to the taxpayer. To burn 4 functional vehicles just out of caution seemed like reckless cowboy behavior to the American planners. The response from the SAS headquarters in Hereford was polite, brief, and absolutely unyielding. The British explained the core of their philosophy to the CIA and the Pentagon. If the Iraqis had captured even one working radio with the current frequency tables, the entire coalition would have been forced to undergo a theater-wide communications refit. The cost of that move? $12 million. And at least 72 hours of total radio silence across the front. During that window, Special Forces would have been stranded without support, and the Air Force would have been flying blind. From that perspective, burning $300,000 worth of iron was the cheapest and most professional decision made in the entire war. This incident changed the rules of the game forever. The Americans, who previously obsessed over every serial number, began studying the British leave no trace doctrine. They realized that in modern warfare, a piece of information is worth 10 times more than the most expensive off-roader ever built. The fate of the heroes of Delta 40 followed the typical pattern of the regiment. Not a single man received a medal for the trek. In the SAS, it is understood that completing the task is the reward, and wearing a chest full of tin is considered poor form. The sergeant major who gave the order to burn it all served another 7 years before retiring in '98. He didn't write a memoir, he didn't do talk shows, and he didn't become a consultant for Hollywood action movies. He simply vanished into civilian life, remaining a quiet pensioner to his neighbors. Many of those 16 men went on to fight in Bosnia, Sierra Leone, and back to Iraq in 2003. The same staff sergeant who torched his rover in '91 was back in the Anbar Desert 14 years later, training a new generation of recruits. He told them, "Remember this, lads, the iron is just a tool. It can break, and it can fail you. But as long as you have your legs and your head, the mission continues." The story of Delta 40 isn't about shooting and explosions. It's a story about the fact that true professionalism is the ability to walk away from everything you own when it becomes a threat to the objective. On that long road home in the freezing desert, 16 men proved that human will is still more reliable than any engine. And the next time you hear about impossible conditions, remember the men who adjusted their rucksacks and walked through hell after their technology turned to ash.